welcome to the Solidarity Show, your weekly broadcast where we bring you everything union news, unions updates, what we need to do to keep active and keep building union power, but we also try and entertain you a little bit. So Liam, what have we got on the agenda tonight?
Oh, good. Big night tonight, Emma. Before we get into it, I want to acknowledge traditional owners of the land on which we meet all across this country and pay my respects to elders past and present. But yes, Emma, big night tonight. We've got Jim Stanford from the Centre for Future Work to talk to us all about JobKeeper, JobSeeker, everything you needed to know about what's going on in the economy at the moment. We had some big data numbers come out this week about unemployment and what industries are being impacted in terms of JobKeeper. So we're really keen to dig into all of that with someone who is, arguably one of the leading labour economists in our movement, not just here in Australia, but from around the world. So we're really excited to hear from Jim tonight. As you mentioned before, we're broadcasting obviously live on the Zoom link, but we're also into Facebook Live as well. So for everybody, welcome on Facebook. And tomorrow we're going to be uploading this into YouTube so that you can watch it all again and share it with your friends and colleagues. So yeah, a big night tonight and really looking forward to it.
And no doubt people will be watching that back. So now, Liam, can you give us a bit of an update of where things are up to this week?
Yeah, so look, a very big week again this week, and the focus has again shifted back to reopening the economy and what reopening the economy is going to look like. There's obviously a big decision to be made by the National Cabinet this Friday about what, if any, social distancing, public health measures will be relaxed. And obviously the big concern is that means that work is going to gradually continue to uptick, which is great, but we have to make sure that it's done safely. And a lot of the debate this week, and indeed over the last few weeks, has been about how do we reopen parts of the economy safely? And as our movement has been talking about for some time, how do we make sure even the parts that are open right now continue to be safe or actually are made safe? And we've seen some troubling examples of that this week, which I'm going to touch on in a minute. But I think in terms of thinking about the work health and safety aspects, we need to reflect on the events of the last few weeks, and in particular, the National Cabinet's decision to release work health and safety principles and endorse those. And some of those key principles were obviously that public health remains the number one priority. So as we turn to reopening parts of the economy, we should only be doing that provided that we can ensure public health and that we're not going to see a second round of infections and transmission like we have in other countries, most notably in Singapore. Also that workers and unions are required to be consulted about how workplaces make themselves COVID safe, and that in particular, bosses must be implementing the highest possible and practical controls in terms of preventing workers from being exposed to COVID. This is a really important one and is at the centre of our push this week to ensure that we have better work health and safety laws that actually legally require employers to apply the highest possible controls. As many would have seen from Sally and others doing media over the last few days, we've come out with 3 clear things that have to be done in order to reopen our economy safely. We have to have regulations that require employers to apply the highest possible controls in their workplaces. We must have a uniform national approach that employers are obliged to tell health and safety authorities, not just public health authorities, about COVID outbreaks in their workplaces. It's really important that our health and safety regulators are notified when there's a COVID outbreak in a workplace so that they can come in and make sure that the controls that are in place are going to be effective in terms of stopping future transmission. And again, everyone would have seen the debate about paid pandemic leave, previously called special paid leave, which many companies had signed up to previously, but we are now calling to have included in the National Employment Standards, to have as a statutory right for all workers. This is really important. Australia is particularly vulnerable with 1 in 3 workers having no access to paid sick leave. We are very worried that as we start to reopen parts of the economy, indeed, many workers are going to be faced with the grueling decision of whether they go to work with a bit of a cough and a sniffle, or whether they isolate, get a test, and potentially need to stay off work for a while. People shouldn't be expected to choose between going to work safely and putting food on the table. So those are the key issues we've got. Obviously, everyone would have seen some of the issues that have revolved around the abattoir in Melbourne. That's very troubling. We know throughout the meat industry, there are high levels of insecure work and indeed temporary workers, both who fall outside the JobKeeper and JobSeeker rules. It's important that we're fighting to make sure that that scheme is broader coverage, and we're really interested to hear from Jim a bit later on about how that's really working. So that's the main push this week. We've got a lot of activities planned in the week leading up to Parliament, which comes back next Tuesday. And we really want to make this issue, in particular around paid pandemic leave, central to the public debate over the course of the next week.
Thanks for that update, Liam. And look, we've got some questions that have come through over email over last week. So I just want to dive straight in. Andrew asks, has there been a noticeable drop in workplace health and safety standards during the pandemic?
It's a really good question, Andrew. So obviously the main focus of all unions in terms of health and safety at the moment has been making sure that workplaces are practicing the most effective controls. And whilst it's comforting to see that many workplaces are doing that, and indeed what we've seen where practical, many workers are working remotely, but in particular, we know that unions have fought very hard in workplaces that do have to remain open because it's not practical to have people working remotely, that physical distancing is being practiced. And that is the most effective control. Yes, it's important to have hand hygiene and respiratory hygiene in there, but physical distancing, making sure that you are 1.5 meters separated from your colleagues, that there are no more than one person per 4 square meters in a workplace. That's really important. But we also know that there is a big divide in this country, not surprisingly, and this is not just in relation to COVID, it's generally with relation to all health and safety, is that if you're in a unionised workplace where you do exercise your rights, where you have elected health and safety reps that are trained by your union, you are unfortunately more likely to have safer workplaces. And that's not just for COVID, but for everything else. And we're hearing really troubling reports about workplaces that are not organised, that don't have union health and safety reps, that are not getting that sort of protection. So unfortunately, to your question, Andrew, yes, we are seeing standards slip, and they're really important right now because it's not just about workers in those workplaces. It's about guarding us all against community transmission.
Exactly right. Tony asked, if a worker gets sick from COVID-19 in their workplace, but then passes away at home, is this considered a workplace death, Liam?
It's a really good question. So we've seen, unfortunately, in many countries now, workers who are exposed to COVID, whether it be in a healthcare setting or indeed in others, and I mentioned the meat industry before, in the US alone, 5,000 meat workers have tested positive for COVID. 20 of them have died as a result of it. Those are absolutely workplace deaths. A workplace death is a death that arises as a result of your work. And indeed, if you contract an illness in the course of your employment, that is a workers' compensation injury, and indeed it's a workplace fatality if you were to die. Fortunately, we haven't seen that happen yet in Australia, and we really hope that it doesn't. But unions are very concerned about that, in particular in the sectors that are really on the front line.
I've got another question here, Liam, from Margaret. Is JobKeeper being taxed as a lump sum? And if so, how will this affect me? Yep,
good question, Margaret. So JobKeeper is a payment that is paid to your employer. Essentially, JobKeeper is not what is paid to the worker. What is paid to the worker is your ordinary salary if you're working. So if you're working your normal, whether it be 38 hours a week, or if you're part-time less than that, you will be paid those hours and the money that goes with it and taxed accordingly. Likewise, if you are in a stood down situation and your employer is just paying you the $750 per week, you will be taxed on that as if it is earnings.
And finally, I think we've got time for one more, which is how should workers in a dispute with their boss over JobKeeper pursue this dispute?
The first thing you should be doing is contacting your union. If it is a dispute about whether your employer is applying for JobKeeper, as we've seen so many cases now, and Jim will talk a little bit about the numbers in terms of those that have applied for JobKeeper, but we hear constantly reports of employers that are just saying, it's all too hard, I can't be bothered, and not doing the right thing by those workers. Your first point of call is your union. Absolutely, we are naming and shaming companies that are not doing the right thing. And indeed, if it's a dispute about whether JobKeeper is being paid appropriately, whether workers are being passed on the money, or indeed if it's a dispute about the stand down provisions, there are rights for workers to exercise and get resolution to those disputes, in particular in relation to the stand down one, where workers can, through their unions, bring disputes before the Fair Work Commission about the stand down arrangements, or stand up arrangements as they're often called.
Hey, thanks for Liam. And that's all we have time for today. But for those listening in at home, if you have a question, please feel free to send us an email, send us your questions. Doc Liam will put it, our email address into the chat box. Now, Liam, we have a pretty special segment up next.
We do. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our next guest. It is an important part of our show every week to do an interview with someone on the front lines. And this week we've got Myrna, who I'm hoping is with us right now. Here she is. Welcome, Myrna.
Thank you, Liam.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work and what it is that you do?
Okay, thank you, Liam. Thanks, Emma. Look, I work in frontline banking. I represent members of the Finance Sector Union, which is a great union, been around for 100 years, representing and supporting its members. I'm helping to deliver essential services in banking to many vulnerable customers right now. People who have lost their jobs, people who have families and who have reduced income, people who don't qualify for job seeker or job keeper. And then vulnerable customers that are perhaps farming families in remote and regional Australia. So those people have just been reeling from bushfires just recently through the summer. So they're suffering some financial hardship already. So I'm delivering services to some of our most vulnerable people in our communities. Some of these people are, they're from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. They are customers that are elderly or don't have a debit card. They may not have access to internet banking. And many of these people are seeking repayment holidays or deferrals on their lending facilities because they've reduced income. So it's a tough gig, but I feel really happy and extremely fortunate to be helping those people. So that's a little bit about what I do.
I want to say thank you for the work you do, first and foremost. And the second thing I want to say to you is I love your union t-shirt. People might not be able to see it otherwise.
Yeah. See it. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
The mighty Finance Sector Union.
Yeah, the Finance Sector Union's just celebrated its 100 years. So it's the only union that represents finance sector workers. So, yeah.
That's something to be proud of, that's for sure. Now, Myrna, you just described to us just the diversity of the people that come through the door, but under enormous financial stress and dealing with many complexities of what that brings in terms of their families and themselves. So can you just take us through what that has meant for you in terms of how is that the work during this COVID-19 pandemic, how has that changed your work and industry?
Emma and Liam and everyone listening, there are three main issues for bank workers and people who work in the finance sector right now. The first is job security. I guess many people have seen some branch closures more recently. The banks at the moment and financial institutions since the beginning of this pandemic are fast tracking their customers to digital and online platforms. And ultimately leads to job losses and branch closures. So, and some offshoring as well. So the future of work for these people without a commitment from the banks to provide some adequate training to their remaining staff is tenuous. I'm not sure. The second issue is targets. So I'm not sure that many people know that banking staff still have to meet their targets and their sales targets, and they can be anything from home loan applications to opening accounts and selling insurance. So it's just part of what we do, and we help our customers to achieve the right outcomes and deliver good solutions for them. But it's that's something that we have to do. So sales targets for workers and ensuring work for the future is there. And we're saying to the banks, hey, let's work together with the Finance Sector Union to deliver the jobs of the future. Let's retrain our staff to equip them to do that. So let's not shed any more people. Let's not put any more workers on the job keeper and job seeker queues. Let's do the right thing.
And I'm curious on that. How are the banks sort of behaving in this crisis? I mean, obviously banks are actually excluded from JobKeeper, so they actually can't apply for JobKeeper in that sense. But I'm curious, like your sales targets are still there to sell home loans and mortgages, but yet we know that both of those as transactions are falling. what are the banks doing?
They
How are you
are.
working with your workmates to sort of make sure that people that work for the bank are taken care of?
Look, we're all working together and we're trying to band together. The finance sector union are helping their members greatly. We're spreading the word about how important it is to join your union and bring about better outcomes for workers and for our customers as well. So it's a tricky gig. Sales targets are still there. We're asking the banks to suspend or alter sales targets at this very, very, very distressful time for so many people. So we're asking the banks to step up and do that. Some banks are doing that, so that's excellent. Some are not. Mm-hmm. So it's the finance sector union is working very, very hard to ask the banks to look out not only for their customers as they're doing well, but to also look after their staff.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like you and your colleagues are doing what you can to build union power during this time. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story. There's a lot of comrades on the line tonight. Is there one message that you would like to leave with them?
Yes. Solidarity and supporting each other is a fundamental principle of the union movement. It's why we're all here tonight.
Indeed.
I want to say together we can achieve much. Many industries are changing rapidly right now, including the banking and financial institutions. And it's important that we work cohesively with our employers to give workers job security moving forward. That's, I guess, the critical thing we've got to be talking about.
Well said, Nessa. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next, we have up our favourite cultural icon, Francis Leach. How are you going,
other
Francis?
cultural icons, Emma? I'm only aware of the one. He can't just be our favourite. He's the only cultural icon we have.
The only.
Hey, hey Liam, I don't think I'm being seen at the moment because my video has stopped. I don't know why.
I think that was me. You kind of jumped in
Emma,
early.
Emma blocked you.
You were really keen to get on the screen, and I just had to shut it down.
Sorry about that. I was gate crashing the party. How are you both?
Good. And you?
Not too bad. Been a busy week at work, but also a bit of time to catch up on a couple of things I want to share with you. Shall we start with something that you should listen to this week?
Yes.
There's a cracking podcast. It's called Rabbit Hole. The New York Times do fabulous podcasts. I don't know if you listen to the Daily, their daily sort of news service that they do. Well, Rabbit Hole's been put together by one of their journalists called Kevin Roos, who, after the shootings in Christchurch last year, asked a simple question: what's the internet doing to us? And his podcast is an investigation of that, quite simply. And it starts by tracking the activities of one ordinary kid growing up in Ohio called Caleb, who's a little bit disaffected, stuck in his room playing video games. And we discover how Caleb gets drawn into the alt-right world through the power of the YouTube algorithm, which is designed to make you keep watching, extend the time watching. And he ends up watching Stefan Molyneux, who's this nutty right-wing, misogynist, alt-right speaker who drives him towards some extreme behaviour. But his example is just one example of how the algorithms are dominating our lives in so many ways. The fact that Amazon or YouTube can tell you what you like and they can second guess what you're going to eat and where you're going to be. If you're fascinated by that stuff, or you find yourself being a slave to the algorithm, check out Rabbit Hole. It's a 6-part podcast, not too long, but yeah, all your worst fears, Liam and Emma, about the power of the internet, big business, and the sort of alt-right politics that have taken over that space will be realised by listening to it. It's really quite frightening, but really extraordinary.
Well, as you know, Francis, we're now broadcasting onto YouTube, so I'm hoping the algorithm is getting a slightly progressive slant this week, and indeed we are taking people, hopefully not from their video games in Ohio, but maybe suburban metropolitan Australian cities into our progressive movement instead. Yeah,
it's great. Look, as a radio broadcaster, listening to it's brilliantly made, and yeah, it is just mind-blowing how powerful and how easily we've allowed these algorithms and this digital technology to dominate our lives. So check that one out.
Well, that's good, comrade. So that's what we listen to. What have you been watching this week?
Look, SBS, I keep going back there. I love it. It's free, the SBS streaming service. It's so rich with content. And they've just been broadcasting the last week or two, Unforgivable Blackness. It's a film made by Ken Burns, the master American documentary maker who did the fabulous film on the Vietnam War recently. He's done films about the jazz era. His film on LinkedIn's amazing. He's an American auteur. This one's about Jack Johnson, who was the first black heavyweight champion of the world in the late 19th and 20th century. He kept beating up on big white guys, and he kept winning title after title after title. In fact, he fought in Sydney in 1908, Boxing Day 1908, and beat Tommy Darcy, the Canadian challenger, in Australia in front of a huge crowd at Rushcutters Bay. And this is about race and relations at a time that eugenics was dominating the discussion. How could this big, proud black man keep beating the best that white society could present to him as a boxer? His story is amazing. It's in 2 parts, the Burns documentary, including great footage of that fight at Rushcutters Bay. SBS, you can pick it up just on the streaming service. The book's brilliant. The film's up there now. It's called Unforgivable Blackness. And yeah, it's a really great piece of filmmaking.
Well, thank you, Francis, for delivering another week, mates. And that was a beauty. See you next time.
Enjoy. Speak then.
Stay safe.
Liam, you told us earlier about some of the economic developments of this week, in particular around JobKeeper, and our next guest is going to talk us through some of the big economic issues at the moment.
Well, I'd like to welcome, obviously, Dr. Jim Stanford from the Centre for Future Work, who is well known to many comrades. I see he's already been active in the chat saying hello to many people that are online with us now. So, you know, thanks very much, Jim, for joining us. And it has been like a whirlwind couple of months. And I'm sure the experience you're going through, obviously, at home in Canada with your family and friends is important to us as well. So we're keen to hear what's happening on other parts of the world. But, you know, JobKeeper has been a very Australian way of dealing with this. And obviously those payments started rolling out this week to business, nearly 5 weeks after the actual announcement that the government made. And last week, Treasury reported to the Parliament about how many businesses, we understand about a bit over 500,000 and indeed nearly 3 million workers now covered by it. You know, what is this saying about the current state of the economy? What are you seeing at the moment in terms of these sort of figures that have been announced and indeed the data that's come out just in the last few days?
Yeah, there has been a lot of data, Liam, showing exactly how quickly and deeply the economy is sinking because of the lockdowns that are required for health purposes. There's actually some newer data now that Treasury's reported. They think about 750,000 businesses have applied for JobKeeper, around 4.5 million workers covered by it. That's still a bit slow, frankly. And the idea of subsidizing wages to keep people in their jobs so that they aren't unemployed during the shutdown has been applied in many countries around the world. Australia was actually a bit slow coming to the pump. And other countries, including New Zealand, Canada, France, actually did a better job of rolling the money out more quickly. Now, the government had budgeted originally for 6 million workers to be covered by this scheme. So, you know, I think they are encountering some delays in the rollout, and also probably some of the restrictions on access to the program are limiting the scope of the coverage a bit. I think we're seeing that happening as well.
And Jim, you talked about the data and what that looks like this week. Can you tell us what, from the data we've seen so far, what can you tell us about the industries that are being impacted?
Yeah, I think to their credit, the public servants at the Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, have done a fabulous job at collecting some unconventional statistics and getting it out quickly so that we could get a better handle on what's happening. For example, they recently published some data based on weekly wage payments that come through their one-touch payment system, and showed how quickly employment is falling. About 7.5% of employed people have lost their jobs entirely. And that would put the unemployment rate right now at something like 12 or 13%, and probably going higher. The hardest hit industries, no surprise, hospitality, accommodation, food services, recreation, and personal services, where you've seen big declines in employment of as much as 30%. Another source of data that's interesting is how many businesses in each sector of the economy have applied or intend to apply for the JobKeeper subsidy. Some interesting results there, sometimes counterintuitively. The industry where the highest proportion of businesses has applied or plans to apply was construction, curiously enough, because construction hasn't had the worst downturn in actual activity and employment. That could reflect the fact that there's a lot of sole traders in the construction sector, and they've decided to go ahead and apply. So lots of interesting statistics. The common thing, Emma, is that across the board, this is a disaster. No matter what sector you work in, we're facing the absolute worst downturn since the Depression, potentially worse than the Depression. And this is why we need government to pull out all the stops to make sure that everybody's covered by these programs and that we get back to work as safely as we can. And in the meantime, people are supported with income guarantees.
Yeah, so Jim, that's really important. I think, you know, when we talk about the industries that are hard hit versus the ones that are potentially claiming, what do you make of that? I mean, I would have thought instinctively that hospitality, tourism, accommodation services would be those sort of businesses where you get near to 100% applying for JobKeeper, and yet we're still seeing them lagging at that sort of 75%. And yet construction, which as you point out, is operating not necessarily at full capacity, but is definitely nowhere near as impacted, is actually claiming for more businesses. What's that telling you?
Right. Well, it does show that there's a difference between who's getting laid off or stood down from their jobs and which businesses are applying for the scheme. So accommodation and food services is by far the hardest hit sector, as we should know, because those are the places that we shut down immediately when the health emergency started. Yet, you know, a very strong proportion of businesses, 76% are applying, but not all of them. So it shows that there is a gap between the workers who need the support and the fact that the government is delivering this benefit through the employer. That's an interesting thing about JobKeeper. As you noted, Liam, earlier, the benefit is actually paid to the employer, and the employer has to nominate to submit to claim the benefit. So there could be employers who aren't applying for various reasons. They might think they don't qualify. They haven't experienced the size of the drop in revenue that's required. It could be that they hired a lot of the workers that the government has so arbitrarily excluded from the scheme. Yeah. You know, remember, there's 2 million workers, either casuals who have been with their current employer for less than 12 months, or foreign temporary workers from anywhere other than New Zealand. So if you're an employer who hired those people and they were working, well, lo and behold, this benefit isn't available for you and you might not apply. So I think we are seeing some of the cracks in the system, some of the flaws in those programs, and this explains why some of the numbers look a bit anomalous.
It's interesting on the numbers front because you know, the government spoke this was going to be a $130 billion package. It was going to cover 6 million workers, and we haven't really even gotten out the gates, and it doesn't look like we're going to get to the 6 million workers. Not, as you pointed out, because there are not 6 million workers desperately in need of wage subsidy support, but indeed because the government has arbitrarily, you know, eliminated 2 million of them. You know, is it likely that we're going to hit the 130 billion? And if we're not, should we not be calling for it now to say, this is the exact reason why we need to expand the scheme? We're not going to spend the money you set aside. We can quite easily put these, you know, 2 million workers into the scheme. From what we understand, even on the original estimates, including everybody, would only add approximately an extra $4 billion. So surely, you know, this is a louder call that can be made now that the numbers are falling short.
Yeah, 100%. You know, I mean, the number will still go higher than it is, but I never believed that $130 billion number. I thought the government was out there, you know, kind of pounding its chest. They were under pressure at the time. Remember, Australia was one of the last countries in the industrial world to come up with this kind of a scheme. And initially the government had refused to do it. So then they wanted to come out and, you know, sort of say, well, look how good we are. And Australia's wage subsidy scheme is not generous by international standards. You know, for full-time workers, it's only covering a little bit more than half of what their pre-pandemic wages would have been. This is a funny thing, Liam. I'm at my office.
The lights are out in Canada.
That's a very dramatic way to end.
It's a lovely, yeah. I kind of look like a Hollywood horror movie or something here. It's an energy conservation measure, and the lights go off every hour after 5 o'clock. I can't believe it. So,
well, this is a country that takes climate change seriously. Yeah, we've got everything on. I can tell you that.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry about that, but in reality, they aren't going to spend as much as they claimed, and they absolutely have to come to the pump. They legislatively, they gave the government, they gave the treasurer the authority with the stroke of his pen to say that these workers, the casual workers and the foreign visa workers who've been excluded, can be included. And those are people, most of whom have nothing else to fall back on. And if we're concerned with supporting people, supporting the employers who hired those people, remember the JobKeeper benefit goes to employers, not to the worker, and protecting public health, then we've got to do something for these people, and the government can absolutely afford to do it.
And look, while we're talking about the government and how they could increase this measure, obviously they made lots and lots of noise about this JobKeeper scheme only sticking around until October, and that at the end of that, it will be over. But from your perspective, what will that mean for the unemployment rate? And what's the danger in cutting JobKeeper off as early as October?
Yeah, I think there's two kinds of dangers there, Emma. I mean, the first one, obviously, that we're all worried about is that it won't be safe to go back to work in October. We don't know how this virus is going to unfold. We don't know what the risks of second or third waves is going to be. We don't even know, frankly, if people are immune after they've got it. So there's all kinds of health risks there, and the government has to be prepared for those. There's also an enormous economic risk. Even if we're allowed to get back to work, I think the damage to the private sector of the economy is going to be so severe. This is not, this is not a normal cyclical downturn. This is a catastrophe, and we're looking at declines in employment and GDP of potentially 20% or more. And it's going to require dramatic action, sustained government-led action in public investment, infrastructure, expanded public services, permanent increases in things like aged care work in order to provide those services. And that's not all going to be accomplished by October. So the government is absolutely going to have to be ready to extend this program and hopefully expand it by covering those groups of workers who've been excluded.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Jim. And I know in a similar vein, I mean, it's early days, but sort of finally, what should we as a progressive movement be thinking about? How is COVID going to reshape not just our society, but our economy in the future? And what should we as a movement and other progressive movements be advocating for as we sort of build back our economy?
Yeah, I mean, this is a moment of great fear and uncertainty and challenge, Liam, obviously, for workers and their unions. But if we look at history, at moments of crisis like this, sometimes there are actually moments of transformation and moments when the union movement and progressive movements made huge gains, precisely because workers suddenly realize if they don't have a union at their back, that they're lost. And just think about, the millions of Australians who go to work and they wonder if it's going to be safe, if they're going to catch a disease and literally die. And all of a sudden they realize, listen, no one's going to take care of me unless I join with my fellow workers. And we've seen in the Depression, we saw in World War II, we've seen in other moments of historical crisis, workers coming together and saying, we got to change things. And this pandemic has clearly highlighted many of the things we need to change. Our social safety net has to be fixed so that it covers all insecure and precarious workers. The level of benefits paid in that system has to be increased. If the government thinks now that they've doubled the job seeker benefit, if they think they're going to cut it in half again, that we should have absolute, peaceful riots in the streets if the government tries to do that. Same goes for how we value some of the so-called menial jobs that have been, devalued for years. Things like retail clerks and cleaners and drivers, people who are doing things that are essential for our lives and our safety right now, and yet we paid them like crap for years. So we've got to revalue those things. We've got to elevate public care and public well-being to the top of the priority list rather than competitiveness and balanced budgets and all of the other nonsense that has been guiding us. So those are all changes that we have to make, and we can change work for the good once we come through this pandemic if we organize and fight for it.
Well, Dr. Jim Stanford, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Complete with the Hollywood lighting here. Sorry, sorry about that.
We've got to do this again. No, we've got to do it again with that lighting. Thank you so much.
Take care. Jim. Thanks for what you guys are doing. You're doing a great job. Thank you for the solidarity you're building.
Appreciate it. Thanks, comrade. Well, Emma, what's next?
Well, Liam, you talked about it at the beginning of the show. You gave us an update. Obviously, states are looking at, and the government's looking at, relaxing these social distancing measures, but there's certain things that we need to improve in terms of help making workplaces safe. So tell us what we should be doing and being involved in this week.
Yeah, so look, this week, as I said in our update, the real push at the moment is about reopening the economy. Our movement has said we are absolutely committed to getting people back into work and reopening workplaces, but it has to be done safely. Safely, not just for the workers that are going to be walking back into those workplaces or continuing to work in those workplaces, but for the fact that actually we will undo all the great work that we've done as a community to suppress this virus. If we allow second wave infections to happen, which has happened in countries like Singapore, where we saw in particular in migrant communities and in communities where there was insecure work, infection took off again, we will have undone so much of that good work. And we're going to be putting, workers at the front and center of this next phase. So we've got really clear asks on the government, a regulation to require employers to make workers healthy and safe as possible, notifications for any worker that's infected with COVID-19 in the workplace to health and safety authorities, and paid pandemic leave. We're meeting with the government over the next couple of days. We have got a petition out there already, which has got 100,000 signatures for paid pandemic leave. And we're going to be asking you to email and contact members of parliament and state and territory premiers to make sure that they put in place the appropriate rules to protect workers. So that's the big push on this week. And, we want everyone to get around it.
Great. Just hit those socials. You know where to find it tomorrow. Australian unions, share, get other people to share and get involved. Well, that's all we have time for this evening. And well, it's been a great show. We've had Myrna, Jim and Francis, and thank you so much for their contributions. And Liam, thank you again for a great week. Can you believe that was our 4th episode?
I know, it's just flying by. It's great to come in here every Wednesday and hear what people are doing and get the questions. So if you've got questions for next week, shoot them in. Gives us a really good chance to make sure we're prepared for the answers and we get you the right information. So thanks everyone. Stay safe between now and next Wednesday, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.